The next piece you'll see from me is a piece called FedWorld. And in FedWorld, I look at the summary of economic projections. And the summary of economic projections tells us that what the people in the insiders, I guess, the 17 members who are either Fed presidents or who are members of the federal, the FOMC, think about where economic output is going, where inflation is going, and where interest rates are going. It's not 100% accurate, but things that these Fed members think are more likely to happen than not. So if we look at change in GDP, what we see is that the 17 members of the Fed, the 17 leading members of the Fed, think that growth this year will be 1.8%. It'll increase next year to 2%. The year after that, 2018, is 2%, and then it stabilises down at a long-term average of about 1.8%. Now, we've talked about this 1.8% before as the combination of an average of long-term productivity growth plus long-term growth in the labour force. Unemployment, they think will end this year at 4.8%, which is slightly lower than the current rate of 4.9. It then drifts down in 17 to 4.6%, finds a low in 18 of 4.5%, and in 19 starts to drift up to 4.6%. In the long term, it's about 4.8%. So we guess that that's their estimate for the natural level of unemployment. Core PCE, people have asked me about the core personal consumption deflator and why they use it and why they don't use the core CPI. The core personal consumption deflator is calculated as part of the national accounts. And the difference between it and the CPI is that the proportions on which expenditure is made are surveyed every quarter, and so the proportions of the weightings change every quarter. So it more accurately measures current consumption tastes. For example, if people are buying on the web instead of buying at Kmart, it's reflected in the personal consumption deflator rather more rapidly than it is in the CPI, and that's why the Fed tend to prefer this. Normally, the personal consumption deflator runs about 50 basis points lower than the CPI. Right now, for whatever reason, it's running about 70 basis points lower than the CPI, but we'd expect it to kick up over the year ahead. So the Fed looks at the core personal consumption deflator and says that it expects it to end this year at 1.7%. It gets up in 17 to 1.9% and reaches its target of 2% in 2018. And out of that, the Fed decides on where it thinks the trajectory of the Fed funds rate will go. And it thinks that at the end of this year, rates will be 60 basis points. Rates are currently, the Fed funds rate is currently 40 basis points. That means you've got to have one more rate hike. The only plausible time you can have that rate hike is in December. So therefore, it indicates a December rate hike. The following year, the Fed funds rate goes up to 1.1%. So you've got two rate hikes next year. The year after that, it goes to 1.9%, which is three rate hikes that year, three rate hikes the following year, and then finally it gets to a high of 2.9% in around 2020. I must say, in reading those estimates, I think they would be incredibly benign for equities markets if you had, only one rate hike at the end of this year and two rate hikes at the end of next year. If you put that together with the consensus estimates for US operating earnings per share, you will have a very strong year for US equities next year. But I do think you can say that US bond yields bottomed out in July this year and will trend up slowly over the period ahead. But really, if they see the Fed funds rate only reaching about 2.9% in the long term, it's hard to see a US Treasury bond trading that much higher than that. So again, incredibly benign outlook. My own view is not so benign. I think that growth next year will be more than 2%. I think inflation will take off faster than they think. And the reason I think that is, of course, because our scenario for oil prices suggests a significant recovery in oil prices and other resources next year. But the Fed has plenty of room to move, as Janet Yellen said yesterday, and still control a US economy, providing healthy growth, but with modest inflation.